I'm going to read the prenuptial agreement that Brent Spiner and I have agreed to. It has been, I submitted it to him at the Quebec trial, and we've decided to go with it. I wasn't sure if they wanted to add something to it, but apparently they like it just the way it is, and they're not going to make any changes. I decided, Brett asked me to dress up a little bit, like semi-wedding gown, so it's, I wrote it several years ago, and we considered it our active prenuptial agreement, but apparently Brett never really got it. The Jesuits sabotaged it, so I sent it to him through our YouTube channel, and it's made it to the Quebec trial, and we decided we're going to formally submit this as our prenuptial agreement and make it public. So I'm going to read it on this YouTube channel, and this is a legally valid prenuptial agreement. It has been submitted through the Quebec trial, which is taking place now, and Brent Spiner and the men on my marriage list have agreed to it. So just go ahead and start reading it. This is as close to a wedding gown as I can get, so sort of like to be in the spirit of reading a prenup. Go ahead and bring this around. That's Brent Spiner's music in the background. See if I can get right over here, right this way. I'm committed to Brent Spiner and Vladimir Putin, and to the men on my marriage list, and I'm willing to make this public as well as legal. And there's no law that says I have to marry in the normal sense of the word. And I have determined that if I can't be with Brent or Vladimir, then I'll just stay single the rest of my life, though I consider myself married. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and read the prenuptial agreement that I wrote several years ago, and which has now been submitted into the courts. This is now a legally valid document, because Brent has signed it, and I have signed it. You might say I'm signing it right now by making it public. So you can just consider this my signature. This YouTube video is my signature on the document. Dearest Brent, I composed a prenuptial agreement several years ago, and I think I covered all the bases that I'm concerned about. I feel this is necessary to protect you and me from Jesuit interference with our marriage. If you do decide to make our marriage more legal in writing, please incorporate the following prenuptial agreement into the contract. Actually, they haven't changed anything. They like it just the way it is. He's been communicating with me brain to brain. I wrote it all myself, taking into consideration my experience with the Jesuits. I don't think we'll ever need it. In other words, I don't think Brent and I would ever divorce. We have a very solid relationship. That's the reason I said that. The only thing that would probably break us up would be if the Jesuits killed me or him. But read it. Doesn't it make our marriage seem more valid? It may help to silence Jesuit accusations that you are a game player with women who only likes to have irresponsible sex and not live up to your obligations. I don't believe this about you at all. And I could never marry him if I felt he was like that. Prenuptial agreement between Gail Chord Schuler, and her future husband. The following document I will work on. Okay, let's skip all this. I feel it's necessary for me to have a prenuptial agreement with my future husband due to the Jesuits' obsession with my love life. So this is the document, and I'm working on it. Okay, it's pretty much finished, so let's go on. I act as my own lawyer. I don't trust any lawyer because I have unique problems in my life. And all the men on my marriage list must agree to this prenuptial agreement or drop them from the list, because they will have to sign and agree to this before they marry me. This is the prenuptial agreement. Have them all read it and see if they can live with it. I'm open to suggestions, and you men on my marriage list can suggest stuff to me through satellite brain communications. Actually, they say they like it just the way it is, and they don't want to change a thing. So I'm going to read you what has been submitted into the courts at the Quebec trial. They have accepted this as the prenup between me and Brent Spiner and the men on my marriage list. And Brent Spiner's number one, which I can only marry one man at a time. See, we have backup husbands in case the Jesuits knock out Brent or Vladimir. But I definitely feel we need a prenup before we marry, or we will give the Jesuits wiggle room to cause trouble in our marriage. For the purposes of this document, a marriage is considered a contract between Gail Chord, born September 15, 1957, and a man who is her husband, where she and this man agree to abide together as husband and wife, under the laws of whatever country they live in which both obtain a marriage license and are considered legally married, under the laws of the country they live in or are married in. The wife, Gail Chord, and the husband must be who they claim to be. They cannot be a clone of the person they claim to be. They must be the person they claim to be, born on the same day and in the same place as the person they claim to be, unless either party willingly and knowingly allows the clone to replace the current spouse, in which case this must be agreed upon in writing by all parties involved. If it is discovered that any party to this contract has married a person who is not the person they claim to be, or they have somehow entered into the marriage through deception, so that they have deceived the spouse into believing they are someone other than who they claim to be to the spouse, then the marriage will be considered null and void and unenforceable, and the marriage will be invalid. This prenuptial document covers the rights of dissolution between the two parties who have entered into and maintain a valid marriage. If the marriage is invalid as defined by this paragraph, then the rest of this document is not enforceable because there is no marriage, and no party in this case has any right to any marital claims against the other. In a case such as this, the deceived party can sue the other party for damages caused by criminal deception or fraud, but that will not be covered by this prenuptial agreement. If the fraud was unintentional and the fraudulent person really believed he or she was the spouse that the other intended to marry, then the party that was defrauded must determine who was willingly and knowingly behind the fraud that caused the fraudulent marriage and sue the guilty party or organization for damages, so that he or she can go on with his or her life without the fraudulent marriage partner. Ideally, the real person that should have been the marriage person may be discovered, and the marriage can be saved, and the fraudulent person exported. If the guilty party behind the fraud cannot be found, and the parties no longer desire to continue the fraudulent marriage, then the marriage will be treated as a valid marriage and will fall under the guidelines of this prenuptial agreement. The prenuptial agreement between the parties of this valid marriage is as follows. Prenuptial agreement between Gail Chord Schuler, the woman born September 15, 1957 at Miami, Florida, and any man she marries. This must be signed by all men who are on Gail Schuler's marriage list. If they do not agree to this, remove them from the marriage list. When and if Gail legally marries any man on this list so that she lives with him in a normal husband-wife relationship or is legally married to him in a normal husband-wife relationship, she will print this out and both will sign this as a prenuptial agreement before the marriage. She writes this prenuptial agreement to prevent the use of Jesuit clones to sabotage any future marriage she has with any man on her marriage list. If she gets stuck with a bad clone of a man she has married, she wants to get out of the marriage with minimal consequences. For the purposes of this document, a mental illness is defined as any impairment of mental or emotional function that causes a person to lose the ability to think or act logically and to make decisions and or actions with reason and fairness, and is primarily caused by one's own drug addictions, alcoholism, and or neglect or misuse of the physical body. For the purposes of this document, sex is defined as the actual physical sexual act between a man and a woman. It is not masturbation or fantasizing. It is the actual physical act of the male and female sexual organs meeting together with literal skin touching skin. However, if the impairment of mental emotional function is of a type such as Alzheimer's disease, that the person has absolutely no control over and is definitely of the type that has come upon this person despite his or her attempts to follow a reasonably good health lifestyle, this will not be considered a mental illness but a regular illness, and will be treated as an ordinary illness and not a mental illness for the purposes of this document. For the purposes of this document, extreme negligence of one's health is defined as one who neglects or abuses the needs of his body in such an extreme manner that he or she has habits or a lifestyle not caused by the criminal pressure of others, but by his or her own volition, that could induce a health emergency within a week or a month if he or she was to continue these habits. If the marriage breakup is caused by the infidelity of one or both partners, then the rules for division of property and assets will be upheld. But all rules for the care or provision of the unfaithful spouse in case of health problems at the time of marriage dissolution will not be upheld. No marriage partner is required to pay the health care costs of an unfaithful spouse. An unfaithful spouse is defined as one who has had sex with someone other than his marriage partner and who was not driven to be unfaithful because of the cruelty or abuse of his or her spouse. The spouse is not unfaithful if he or she falls in love with someone other than his spouse, but has not acted on that love with sex with that person, or because his or her spouse beats him or her up or abuses him or her, so that he or she desperately needs another besides his or her spouse for his or her sanity. Abuse is defined as any attitude or action imposed on the marriage partner by the abusive spouse, which denies that spouse's basic needs for shelter, health, and basic needs, such as the need for rest or the need for medicine or food for health, and or which brings strong and unnecessary and prolonged emotional or physical pain to the suffering spouse. To lose one's temper is not abuse, but if you lose your temper and beat up your spouse, that is abuse. To force your spouse to do something bad for their health when they don't want to do it, and when it's not necessary for them to do it, is abuse. Throwing things is not abuse, but if you throw things at your spouse to hurt them, that is. Passion in the bedroom is not abuse. Gail loves a man who is passionate in bed. But to force one to have sex at gunpoint is. Making love to your partner like a machine with no feeling in your moves for years and years is a form of emotional abuse, especially to a woman who needs to feel nourished and loved by the lovemaking experience, though I imagine there are some men who would feel this is emotional abuse. How do you prove this in court? It's almost impossible. But I mention this to show that I have a healthy attitude towards sex in marriage and would never believe that passion in marriage is abuse, except to a sick person who has unhealthy views about the marriage act. Holding a grudge is not abuse. But if you hold a grudge for so long, let me see how much time I have, that your sexual performance in the bedroom becomes a walk on ice for 2 years, that's a form of emotional abuse. If you take delight in hurting your spouse emotionally for over a year and never seem to get over it, it is emotional abuse, or with physical acts of violence, physical abuse as well. Overly restricting your partner so that he or she feels to please your demands, he or she must always feel as if a boa constrictor is around his or her neck is a form of emotional abuse. But because you will emotionally and or physically abuse your spouse if they don't meet your impossible demands. Okay, we're going to have to move on to a second tape.